Thank you. Good evening, and welcome to the 2015 Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis Medal Dinner. And Dan, congratulations. As I have said to you, it is a great honor to honor you. Thank you for giving us the privilege of recognizing you tonight. Okay, is this great or what? And it even gets better if you listen back there. I am Vince Cipolla, and it has been a great honor for me to serve this amazing and important institution as board president for nearly 7 years, and to serve with such a group of tremendously gifted and passionate New Yorkers. Now, some of you aren't going to like this because I just told you to sit down. Okay, but I'm going to do this. But I would like to ask the MES Board of Directors and Emeritine Directors to stand up. Come on, stand up just for a second. We want to see you. We want to thank you for your dedication to this great organization and for your work in helping keep New York, New York. And standing, as you did, and I know a few of you waved over there, and standing for excellence in all we do. A very special thanks to our most recent past chair, the very fabulous Jeannie Birch, and our new chair, the very fabulous Fred Eisman, for your partnership and leadership in steering the ship, and for your unwavering commitment to MAS's important work. And since I have the microphone, I'm not stopping there and want to take a moment right at the top to thank the tirelessly passionate MAS staff. I can't name them all, but I would be remiss in not recognizing the leadership of our Executive Director, Margaret Newman, Robert Libby, Mary Rowe, Andre Allaire, and Megan Barron, and the entire team for all the work that went into tonight and all the work that goes into every day. On behalf of the MAS Board, thank you, Margaret and team. Tonight wouldn't be possible without the extraordinary generosity of all of you and the leadership support provided by Fred Eisman, Jeannie and Bob Birch, and Ed Schuyler in City. A very special thanks. Okay, without question, this is a room of like total superstars. The thinkers, the doers, the designers, the builders, the listeners, those of you listening are going to get extra credit, the leaders. You are the people who make New York happen. And look how good you look. You really do look great. We have 3 past medal recipients in the room tonight: Judy Roden, Bruce Ratner, and Paul Goldberger. We salute you. I could easily talk about 200 of the people here: Steve, Jay, David, Liz, Rick, Richard, Ann, Michael, Susan, Manuela, Jamie, Jeanette, Francis, Vashon, Kathy, Gabriel, Laurie, Enid, Elizabeth, Sophie, Joe, Kent, Kate. All right, Julio, I will stop. Tom, I'll stop. Gary, I'll stop. I know, I can't go on. But there's only one Dan. That would be Dan Doctoroff. I know there are other Dans, but tonight. All right. Now, I'm making these remarks very brief because I want to set a crisp and steady pace for this evening. So, I won't describe MAS's illustrious history, for instance, like saving Grand Central or keeping the lights on in Times Square, or telling you about MAS's critical work today for a new Penn Station in support of our civic assets for smarter zoning, greater diversity of use and livability for all our neighborhoods, and fighting for entrepreneurs and locally owned businesses. I just won't be able to delve into these. I won't. Because I'm leaving it to the next speaker, and your programs have a lot of good information in them too. It's with great pride and pleasure that I have the opportunity to introduce my friend and our amazing and inspiring chair and a true champion of New York. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Fred Eisman.
can really make stuff up. It's wonderful. Thank you, Vin. I want to tell everyone that this extraordinary room is the former first-class ticketing lounge for Cunard. And in that same vein, I want to thank you for the $1.2 million that was ticketed this evening for MAS. Our good ship. So I'm Fred Eisman. I'm chairman of MAS. If one more person addresses me as Mr. Chairman, I'm going to take this Cultural Revolution stuff seriously and reply, comrade. So in the spirit of being crisp, I'm going to take you on a quick tour. In the past 9 days, and this is true, I've been, in this order, to 9 cities. They are Paris, St. Petersburg, Russia, not Florida, London, Frankfurt, Rome, Copenhagen, Zurich, Stockholm, and now New York. Some observations cannot help but arise. In the truly beautiful cities, Paris, St. Petersburg, Rome, Copenhagen, and Stockholm, everyone knows who built what. Whether it's Louis XIV's Invalides, or Catherine the Great's Smolny Institute, or Michelangelo's Campidoglio, where my daughter and I went, or what Bernadotte or Gustav built in Sweden, or the new Maersk Opera House in Copenhagen, most locals can spit out the authors of the built environment. In Frankfurt, which is a truly, truly ugly city, no one can. The only thing that is known is the name of the corporations who've branded those awful buildings. In London, it's interesting. It's divided, as it is in New York. All the good buildings are known, whether Christopher Wren's Cathedral, or Inigo Jones's, or Norman Foster's Great Dome over the British Museum. People know these buildings and know who made them and who designed them. But all the ugly, brutalist buildings are anonymous. So where does New York fit in this mix? We have relatively few names to tie to our buildings. Carrera and Hastings, Candela, Frank Lloyd Wright, Stanford White, Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, Warren and Wetmore, Mies van der Rohe, and as great builders, the Rockefellers to Rockefeller Center, Phyllis Lambert to the Seagram Building, J.P. Morgan to his library, and some clubs. The observation naturally arises that architecture is gesture. We live in a city in which the architectural act is largely anonymous. It is covert. There is no consequence, personal or professional, for building an eyesore. There is no reward, personal or professional, for building something great. Our environment is largely indifferent because we are indifferent. And we are indifferent to it. And why shouldn't architects and builders be indifferent to what they build? Unlike Augustus Caesar, who received credit for finding Rome a city of brick and leaving it a city of marble, or Napoleon III and Haussmann, who received both the blame and the hatred and the kudos for forcibly renovating Paris, we are largely a blank. Robert Moses is our Haussmann. MAS has many missions: livability, Penn Station, sustainability, parks, entrepreneurship, diverse retail, preservation, planning, zoning, and did I mention Penn Station? In its 122nd year, it is reinventing itself for a reinvented city. One of the many things on its agenda is accountability and transparency into the built environment. We're here to recognize tonight the achievement and spirit of Dan Doctoroff. Dan is not anonymous. Hudson Yards will be his legacy, among other things that Dan's done for the city. Dan has vision, he's tenacious, and he's willing to expand passion and energy and personal capital to see a project through, and he's not afraid to put his name on it. He is not indifferent. He's not anonymous. He is the urban citizen we need, and he represents the values of civic engagement of both MAS and Mrs. Onassis in her crusade with MAS to save Grand Central Terminal. It is with great pleasure that we award Dan the Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis Medal this evening. Thank you very much.
Dan has left his mark on New York City in all 5 boroughs in ways that, frankly, I don't think most of us will ever truly grasp.
And then there are all the things that he did that you cannot put a mark on, and that is the change in the attitude of New Yorkers, the change from we can't do things anymore to the big idea, yes, we can do it.
When you see the slab that has been laid, where we will be building Culture Shed, you see the impact that it's going to have on the city, on the waterfront, how it ties in the neighborhood, how the High Line connects to it, and what this entity will do, both publicly and artistically, is extraordinary, and that's Dan Doctoroff.
One of the great legacies from Dan has really not been seen by the public yet. Hudson Yards and what that will become and what that will mean to both the city, the state, and this country. The foresight that Dan had for the site is extraordinary.
He's the unsung hero of the High Line, and we are the great beneficiaries.
I think what Dan saw is New York constantly needs to be improving and constantly needs to be a source where people look at what's happening, what's New York doing that cities all over the country and world can replicate. Perfect, beautiful.
It is a miracle of preservation.
Thank you, Dan, for the High Line.
I think only Dan could have driven the charge of extending the number 7 subway line. It's going to show that we have the capacity to meet the challenges that are in front of us as a city, and I think only Dan could have shown us that.
He also was interested in the Bronx, certainly in Queens, where we built MoMA QNS, and we built it there really because we understood that Queens was going to be part of a much larger plan for the city. Dan and many of his colleagues were instrumental in helping us realize that.
The Barclays Center in Brooklyn is a place in New York City where Dan Doctoroff has left his mark. The commitment that he brought to the project is what carried us forward and allowed us to build what is today considered one of the most beautiful and highest performing arenas in our country.
There's been more development going on, new stores opening up, new franchises coming in the neighborhood.
Thanks, Dan. You're making downtown Brooklyn a bomb.
After 9/11, after New York took such an extraordinary punch, Dan really helped to demonstrate that the way you rebuild physically and emotionally and socially is what will make a resilient city.
The process that went into Plan YC was one that was extremely inclusive, extremely comprehensive. I also think is a very important legacy for him and for the city.
Brooklyn Bridge Park is an astonishing thing. You go there on any weekend, you will see tens of thousands of people using this park.
There's so many things to do here. There's great art, there are places to grill food, there's a pop-up pool, you can play sports.
This park is amazing, and thank you, Dan.
He's also a very strong champion of philanthropy. And you can see that in the contributions he's made to the battle against ALS.
This is a model for people to follow for other diseases as well. So the impact that Dan has had is not on biomedical research, really goes beyond ALS in some ways, which is remarkable.
Dan and I sat right next to each other when I was chief of staff, and some of the most exciting and terrifying moments were when he would swivel in his chair with this grin on his face and say, "You know what we should do?" And he would be about to launch into some idea, and over time I learned to appreciate that there was some reasonable chance that that idea was going to happen.
You know, I hired Dan for the city. I hired Dan for the company. I've now hired Dan for the foundation. Number one, he can't keep a job. And number two, we've never found the right thing for him to do.
New York is a baseball town. It's a town that loves the number 4 hitter in every game, on every team. Dan could have that place anytime he wanted it.
The man is a born leader.
I think of Dan as a real Renaissance man.
He's also a very fierce competitor.
I think he's heroic.
I want to thank Dan for being such a great visionary and friend for the city, for my university, and for me in my life.
Dan, you've put your mark on every part of the city.
And we thank you.
Dan, wherever you are, or whatever your last name might be, you did a great job making this happen.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Dan, for helping to make City Bikes happen. Dan, you're named correctly because you are the man.
Gracias a Dan por el servicio que brinda.
Thank you, Dan. Barclay Center rocks.
I can think of very few people who have done more for our dear city of New York in the last generation than Dan Doctoroff.
Dad, congratulations. We think you're amazing.
Dan, we're so excited about this award that you're receiving. No one deserves it more than you do.
Dad, we're so proud of you. We love you so much.
You took my line.
I'm Jay Kriegel, and the only person I think who competes with Dan for clocking the most miles on a bike around the 5 boroughs is our surprise guest. For Senator Schumer, speaking on video is not enough. He wanted to come up from Washington and say something special to his dear friend, Dan Doctoroff. Senator?
Well, I'll just be brief because the video said it all and it was so well done, just like Dan. And let me just say, you know, Senator Moynihan was a mentor to me, and I know you worked with him so closely. And he said so many things. He said that in public works and in New York City, we should think grand. We shouldn't be afraid of thinking grand. He believed that growth was a wellspring of New York, but doing growth in a smart way, and doing growth in a beautiful way, and doing growth in a way that would be remembered positively for generations was vital. And he also put his love into this city where he was brought up in Hell's Kitchen. And I can't think of a better person who carried out Senator Moynihan's legacy and instructions for this city of ours than Dan Doctoroff. In the video, I mentioned that I don't think anyone in the last generation has done more to see beautiful, smart growth in our city than Dan. Amazing when you think of all the things he has accomplished, and many of the things that he has done will still be accomplished. The rezoning in so many of the neighborhoods, particularly in Brooklyn and Queens, is just taking root now. And people are flocking to the city and living there, but we're preserving the great parts of those neighborhoods at the same time because of Dan's brilliance. And so, if you love New York, you gotta love Dan Doctoroff, because virtually no one I know has done more to see this city on into its great and grand future than Dan. So Dan, we love you. Congratulations.
I met Dan 18 years ago when he first shared his dream to bring the Olympic Games to New York. I had just one reaction. This is the dumbest effing idea I'd ever heard. But he was compelling, and before I knew it, I was ensnared by Dan's seductive power. His crazy Olympic quest became mine, and I soon left my job to spend the next 7 years at his side. Dan's Olympic plan linked together a dozen projects across the city. Some had been talked about for decades. Presented together in one bold package, it especially appealed to those of us frustrated by the sense that government could no longer get big projects done. It didn't take long after Dan entered City Hall to recognize that in addition to this bold vision, Dan also had a remarkable ability to execute. And as we saw in that wonderful video, he has transformed the face of our city as no one has for half a century. But Dan's most distinctive talent is not as a master urban builder, but as a visionary thinker about cities, observing carefully how people live and the way systems and infrastructure make the city work, or sadly, far too often, not work. He is driven by the belief that the New York which he passionately loves can be made, indeed must be made, to work better. Not to be remade as something different, but to continue to be perfected. And he has inspired us to believe that we can once again dream of great things and make them happen. Now, I am a lifelong New Yorker, born in Brooklyn, like Senator Schumer, who thinks he knows everything about this city. And suddenly, this transplanted Michigander rides into town and rejects the received wisdoms that I've long accepted, fearlessly challenging my sacred doctrines with fresh eyes and intrusive questions. Instead of worrying about the prospect of 9 million residents crowding into the city, Dan invoked his virtuous cycle of growth with vast rezonings to attract more residents and jobs that will generate the revenues needed to fund a larger growing city. And instead of watching government just keep reacting to repeated environmental crises and never plan for growth, Dan created Plan YC, which has profoundly altered the focus of city government and MAS as well. It is Dan's passion, his power of narrative, and his ability to inspire that helped lead us out of the despair of 9/11. In that time of our greatest testing, Dan seized the opportunity not just to rebuild, but to reconceive this downtown area as a new kind of 24-hour community, as seemed all but impossible just 13 years ago. Now, Dan isn't perfect. He bets on everything from golf strokes to bike racing to his diet weigh-ins. He can be an exacting boss, driving you relentlessly to be better than you might have thought possible. Some of his demands can be unreasonable. After all, Dan only grasps ideas that have been presented by PowerPoint. And he only accepts one typeface, his beloved Gill Sans font, instinctively rejecting whatever ideas presented in any other font. But when Dan stands in front of a PowerPoint using his favorite font, there's no more persuasive storyteller and compelling advocate. We know that Dan's work is hardly done. He already has a scheme to relocate the Javits Center to Sunnyside Yards, creating a new downtown for Queens. When you hear this ingenious land swap, I suspect that, like me, you will be seduced by another bold Doctoroff dream. And thankfully, I am confident that will not be his last crazy idea to better his beloved New York. Dan, on behalf of the many young talents you have discovered, who are your greatest living legacy, many of whom are here tonight, and so many others whose lives you have impacted, you continue to spur our imagination, challenge our skills, and inspire us to strive for greatness. And we continue to look to you as our leader with gratitude, devotion, affection, and love. So it is my distinct honor to present the Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis Medal to my dear friend, Dan Doctoroff. Dan?
Wow. Thank you, Jay, Fred, Vin, Margaret, and of course, Chuck. Thanks to all of you for such a lovely evening. I could not be more moved or honored. You know, I'd like to share with you a secret. Before Elisa and I moved here in 1983, I hated New York. Seriously, I'd been to New York 3 times before for a total of 4 days. To see the circus in 1968, then to see Annie in 1978, and then to interview hospital purchasing managers in 1979. It would certainly be fair to say that neither the occasions nor the timing of my visits were well calculated to engender any sort of affection for the city. New York was dirty, it was crowded, and it smelled. But more than that, I felt overwhelmed and small. When Elisa took a job at Time Warner, I protested meekly, but dutifully followed as recently married husbands should do. Neither of us thought we would stay for more than a couple of years, and neither of us had any particular dreams or ambitions. We were emphatically not in the 3rd category of New Yorkers E.B. White described in his famous essay, Here in New York, quote, who were born somewhere else and came to New York in quest of something, who give it passion. Tonight, I cannot help but reflect on the journey from there to here. How did this unadventuresome product of the leafy suburbs of Detroit, who aspired to nothing more than a nice upper middle class life in some city other than New York, become a super-driven, fanatical lover of our city? I think the answer can be boiled down to one word: inspiration. Inspiration is what New York does best. Many people, quintessential New Yorkers, inspired me. People who were so passionate about what they did, often in service of New York, with such skill and joy that I couldn't help want to be more, to do more, to give more. People like Peter Solomon, my first boss at Lehman Brothers, who hired me when he had no real reason to, and has remained my mentor ever since. When I was hesitant to accept Mike Bloomberg's offer to become deputy mayor, it was Peter, who had had the same job in the Koch administration, who wrote an 8-page, single-spaced, handwritten letter to me that convinced me to take the job. People like Steve Ross, my friend and fellow Michigander, and yes, that is what we call ourselves, who did come to New York with big dreams, who achieved them all, but at 75 years old is still so driven that he is literally building a new city at Hudson Yards because he understands that New York needs to constantly reinvent itself. People like Liz Diller and David Rockwell and the rest of our talented team at Culture Shed, who are creating something wholly original, important, out of nothing but a dot on a plan, through sheer ingenuity and a stubborn refusal to accept that obstacles actually do exist. People like Jay Kriegel. Well, actually, there are no people like Jay Kriegel. Jay is a New York original, just like his fellow Brooklynite Chuck Schumer, who one way or another has been serving the city of New York for over 50 years. Jay is my very close friend and my guide to everything about life and New York. But more important, he is the most selfless person I have ever met. And then, of course, Mike Bloomberg. For 13 years, I had the privilege of working directly with Mike, who exemplifies everything that New York is all about. He is 3 generations of Rockefellers rolled into one: businessman, philanthropist, and public service, while doing them all with drive, decency, and great skill. Believe it or not, the fierce dialogue that takes place whenever you want to do something in New York, especially with civic organizations like MAS, has inspired me to be smarter, to be a better listener. After I first presented the Olympic plan to Rudy Giuliani and his staff, he asked me into his office for a private chat. Needless to say, I was nervous that he would tell me that it was the dumbest idea he had ever heard. Instead, he said, "Dan, I want to give you some advice." In New York, he went on, no matter how good an idea you have, and you have a great one, there are going to be more opinions than there are people. He said, you can go into Times Square and start giving away $100 bills, and some are going to complain that it's too much. You're going to create welfare dependency. Some are going to complain that it's too little, and some are going to complain that unless you give something to everyone, it just isn't fair. Don't listen to them, he said. Not long after, Jay and I were invited to present the plan to a lunch meeting at the Municipal Art Society. Needless to say, it did not go very well. The criticisms seemed to fly at us from every corner of the room. I was shocked. Jay advised me to stay cool. We went back, somewhat chastened, and reflected on those comments, made some changes, and moved ahead, smarter for the exchange. That was the pattern throughout my years in the Bloomberg administration. I and the amazingly dedicated and creative group of people in City Hall and in the agencies I was so fortunate to lead viewed MAS as a partner, as a teacher, and as an antagonist, but never anything other than motivated by the best intentions for New York. In the end, our plans always came out better. That is why I am so thrilled with the Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis Award tonight. There is no civic organization for which I have greater respect or admiration. In the end, other than my family, whom I love so much, it is New York that inspires me the most. When we were bidding for the Olympics, the taglines I claim we developed, Jay says he did, for New York were the world's second home and an Olympic village every day. We lost, but those taglines were winners, for they express the essence of New York. We are the city, for all of our imperfections, that best represents what we hope the world can become. During the bidding process, the head of a Japanese bank told me that New York was his favorite city in the world. When I asked why, without thinking, he said, "Because it is the only city where I can walk down the street and people ask me for directions." We laugh, but what he was saying was quite profound. Uniquely, we are the city that just assumes that you are one of us, no matter what you wear or what you look like. It is that openness that attracts the dreamers and the strivers, and even those like Elisa and me, who more or less accidentally get caught in the city's net and are magically transformed. Thank you to each of you for inspiring us and never stopping trying to make our great city greater. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dan, and congratulations. And Jay and Fred, thank you. As everyone in this room knows, MAS has been so well served by dozens and dozens of you who serve in our committees, attend our events, and celebrate with us on a terrific night